The two stories we're going to be covering today both involve anonymous phone calls that are tied to a disappearance and a death. We don't know to this day who made them. Were these calls just a prank? Someone who wants to help and doesn't want their identity revealed? Or could the person who is responsible for the disappearance be the one making the calls? First, let's talk about Paul Hibbard. This case is, at its foundation, a missing persons case, but there are special circumstances that, at the time anyway, could have put many other lives in danger as well. This is a case I hadn't heard about until recently, but as soon as I did, I knew I had to cover it. Paul Hibbard was a 25-year-old from Meade, Colorado. He was the son of a Ford Motor Company executive. He was engaged at the time of his disappearance to Paulette Roth and was looking forward to a future with her. Paul had worked for the past 2 years as a geologist at Berg Exploration, a mineral exploration firm based out of Adams County, Colorado. By all accounts, Paul was a friendly and dependable worker who had no known enemies. For his job, Paul would drive a specialized mineral exploration truck that was used to locate deposits of uranium, oil, shale, coal, and other minerals. There was something unique inside the truck that was said at the time to be worth $30,000, which would be roughly the equivalent of $167,000 today. That something was radioactive material. On May 23, 1976, Paul Hibbard got a strange phone call. There was a man on the other end of the line who claimed to work for Paul's boss. He told Paul that he needed his work truck and asked him to bring it to Gillette, Wyoming. Paul was immediately suspicious, thinking the call was not legitimate. When he asked his boss confirmed his suspicions. The call was indeed a hoax. 6 days later, on May 29, 1976, Paul was on a routine geological survey trip to the Gillette, Wyoming area for his job. It was said that he checked into a local motel for the night. He was never seen after that. He was soon reported missing, and police began to search for him and his truck. The owner of the exploration company and Paul's boss, John Berg, was concerned about his employee. Berg stated that the truck had reportedly been seen in southern Canada near Hart, Saskatchewan. He theorized that Hibbard could have just taken the truck and ran, but also pointed out that in the 2 years there, he had always been a reliable employee for him. The other possibility he mentioned, however, could have much more serious consequences. John Berg was concerned that Paul Hibbard had been kidnapped and possibly pressed into service as a logging operative. He said that Hibbard's knowledge, along with the sophisticated instrumentation of the truck, would be valuable to an outlaw geological exploration company. He went on to say the radioactive element in the truck could be a danger to an inexperienced person, but there is no danger as long as the radioactive element stays inside its lead shield. In July, there would be a break in the case. Although Paul and his work truck were still missing, some of the items inside would be located. A resident of Upton, Wyoming, 26-year-old Joseph Dowdy, was caught with close to $10,000 worth of geological items that were said to be from Hibbard's truck. Dowdy had been caught when he tried to sell the stolen items to his employer, a company that logged and drilled for oil, gas, and water wells. Joseph Dowdy was then arrested and charged with grand larceny. He was questioned about Hibbard's disappearance, but didn't tell them anything that was of any real value. He did, however, state that he and Hibbard arranged together to strip the truck and sell the equipment. He then claims that Hibbard took off and he hadn't seen him since. Then on August 20th, almost 3 months after the disappearance, and while Dowdy's larceny case was still pending, an anonymous mail caller phoned in a tip to the Upton, Wyoming police. The tip was reportedly concerning the location of the missing truck and it would prove to be helpful. Acting on the anonymous information, police would locate the specialized panel truck. Unfortunately, Paul Hibbard was not with it. The truck was found parked in a heavily wooded area near several water pits 3 miles northwest of Upton. Campbell County Sheriff said the truck did still have most of the missing equipment and appeared to have been there for some time. They did drain at least one nearby water pit, but there was nothing noteworthy inside. There was also another very concerning discovery inside the truck, though, that could be an ominous clue as to the fate of Paul Hibbard. When the truck was recovered, there was a lot of blood inside. Campbell County Attorney Willis Gear would eventually confirm, quote, "There was blood, a bunch of it, soaked into the seat and the floor mats," end quote. FBI did test and type the blood. However, authorities were unable to find a known sample of Hibbard's blood to compare it to, so unfortunately, connecting it to him definitively was not possible. In January of 1977, Joseph Dowdy would plead guilty to grand larceny in Campbell County District Court in this matter. He would once again insist that Paul Hibbard had cooperated in the theft of items in his work truck. Dowdy was sentenced to 1 to 3 years in the Wyoming State Penitentiary. When asked about the case 1 year after the disappearance, Campbell County Sheriff said that they assumed that Hibbard was deceased, but of course without a body they couldn't be certain. He went on to say that they do have a suspect and some evidence, and it is possible that murder charges would be brought later that summer. However, murder charges would never be filed in this disappearance. As part of my research, I decided to look up Joseph Dowdy to see if there was any mention of him online after he'd served his sentence for the theft in Hibbard's vehicle. I really didn't think I'd find much, but I was wrong. Let's just say that Dowdy has quite the criminal record even after serving his sentence for theft, so I'll mention a couple of them that I came across. In 1991, Dowdy was initially charged with forging a $60,000 check. 3 more charges of larceny appropriations of insurance premiums would later be added. In October of that year, Dowdy and another inmate escaped from the county jail. He then didn't show for a sentencing hearing on December 12th and was picked up on a bench warrant on December 24th. In January of 1992, after earlier pleading guilty, he was sentenced to 2 concurrent 4 to 8 year sentences for forgery and larceny in the Wyoming State Penitentiary. Several years later, Dowdy was employed at Heart 6 Ranch in Jackson, Wyoming, as the ranch manager and the licensed outfitter for the hunting services, which the ranch also provided. In January of 1999, 2 guests at the ranch had applied for non-resident elk licenses, but were denied. Dowdy would then mislead them and tell the 2 guests at the hunting camp that he had special elk licenses for them. A retired game warden who was working as a wrangler at the ranch would overhear these statements and alert authorities. Since the ill-gotten elks that the guests later got were shipped via the mail, on June 23, 2004, Dowdy was found guilty in federal court of illegal transportation of wildlife in interstate commerce. He was sentenced to 14 months in federal prison and fined. In 2008, 4 years after the sentence, Joseph Dowdy died, and with that, any information he had about Paul Hibbard's whereabouts would die with him. As far as my thoughts on this case, I absolutely believe that Joseph Dowdy was involved in the disappearance of Paul Hibbard. Whether he worked alone, I'm not sure, but there is nothing that points to anyone else being involved. I certainly don't believe that Hibbard was colluding with Dowdy in the theft of anything. I believe it was more of a financial motive than using the specialized equipment, but it seemed to be a poorly executed plan. From newspaper accounts, the only items actually removed from the truck were the ones that Dowdy tried to sell to his employer that I assume were recovered by the state police after his arrest. I definitely think that Dowdy was the one who made the mysterious call a few days before the disappearance to try to get Hibbard to meet up with him. When he realized that wouldn't work, he possibly surveilled him and followed him when he left for work that day. Or perhaps he followed Paul to the motel where he checked in, or the job site that day, and attacked him in the truck, leaving behind a lot of blood, and then disposed of his body. He then quickly removes what he can grab out of the truck and takes off. The reason I say it was poorly executed is that the most valuable commodity, the radioactive material, was apparently left in the truck. Whoever assaulted Hibbard didn't even try to take the truck, which in itself had value as it was specially equipped. They went to all the trouble and very possibly even killed someone just to take a few things out of a truck. This is pretty grim to consider, but maybe the person didn't expect Hibbard to put up the kind of fight that it appears he did. I'm unsure of where the truck was found in relation to where he was going to be working the day he disappeared. But if it wasn't close to that location, maybe Hibbard was made to drive, or his assailant drove them to the area, and then the assault took place. Perhaps after the assault, when the cab of the truck was now full of blood, they decided not to get in and drive it somewhere, and just to take a few things out to sell and flee. Sadly, I believe Hibbard's body was disposed of somewhere where it just hasn't been found. But there's always hope that it will be one day. I am curious how Joseph Dowdy knew Paul or knew of him and the truck he drove for work. I'm also unsure if Dowdy could be the anonymous call to police letting them know where to find the truck. I believe Dowdy had already made one anonymous call, so it is possible he made the other one as well. I'm just not sure what motive he would have to lead authorities to the truck. On one hand, it didn't really help him as it would all but exonerate Paul from being involved with all the blood left behind. On the other hand, perhaps he felt it would get some of the heat off of him since the truck and its contents would then be accounted for. I guess it did help in that he was only charged with the theft that was less than $10,000 instead of the full value of the truck and its contents, along with an assault and or a murder charge. But it didn't help with the investigation because the most important thing inside the truck, a human being, was still missing. Could it be possible that someone knew about what Dowdy had done, or had even innocently came across the truck, but when they saw all of the blood inside, they got scared and decided to just phone in the discovery anonymously? Sadly, there has been nothing new concerning the disappearance of Paul Hibbard in many years. I did come across an article online from October of 2023 that I found interesting. It seems that the new owner of an abandoned storage unit in Gillette, Wyoming, came across a human skull. According to authorities, it is male between 30 to 50 years of age. They were testing it to see if it could be determined who it is or if it could have been involved in a crime, but there has been no further information released that I could find. I don't really think it could belong to Hibbard, as all of his remains are missing, but Gillette was where Joseph Dowdy was from and where the anonymous call to Hibbard wanted him to bring the truck, so I wanted to mention it. It is tragic to think that Paul Hibbard was just collateral damage when all someone seemed to want was his truck. Whether the motive was to steal the radioactive material inside or someone wanting to sell something to make a quick buck, Paul was certainly the one who paid the ultimate price. I don't believe that he had anything to do with the planning or execution of what happened that day. Like his friend Kevin Meehan stated in a newspaper article, "We know he didn't disappear. He had too much going for him here. It's not like him. It's 100% not like him." Almost 50 years later, we can still hope that Hibbard's remains can be located, and we can at least have that part of the answers in this mystery. Sometimes I will try to find a few cases with something in common to discuss on the same podcast. I decided to look up other geologists who had gone missing, and that's how I found out about the next case we're going to talk about. This one involves a married couple as well as an anonymous caller, and it sounds more like a movie plot. So let's get started. Robert and Lola Marvin were married on January 11, 1952 in Logan, Utah. They had at one point lived in Denver, Colorado, and were the parents of two sons, George Marvin and Robert Marvin Jr. Lola Marvin was 49 years old and had degrees in both art and education from colleges in Utah, and at one point taught school as well as taught art to deaf children. Robert Marvin was 50 years old and worked as a geologist and was vice president of exploration at the Santa Fe Mining Company. The couple had lived in New Mexico for 8 years and currently lived at 1512 Camino Equestra Northwest in Albuquerque. The exact details are vague, but Lola Marvin did apparently help her husband in some capacity at the mining company where he worked. She was scheduled to fly to Oklahoma City on July 13, 1979, for something work-related regarding her husband's business. Her flight was scheduled to leave at 5:05 p.m. that evening, and an airport ticket showed that she'd arrive for her flight at 4:36 p.m. It was said that, during this time, her husband was in Canada on business. When he returned home on August 31st, he discovered that his wife had never made it to Oklahoma City. Understandably concerned, Robert Marvin and his sons then started to search for her. A logical first step in their search would be to check the Albuquerque airport, so that's where her sons went. But they were not prepared for what they would find. As her sons searched the parking lot of Albuquerque International Airport, they were at first relieved to find their mother's white 1978 Pontiac Grand Le Mans parked in a designated spot. Upon closer inspection, they were horrified at what they saw. Lola Marvin was in the driver's seat with her legs under the steering wheel and the rest of her body slumped toward the passenger seat. She had 3 bullet wounds to the right side of her body that were shot at close range with a .38. Lola Marvin had been murdered. Although her body was found on August 4th around 3 p.m., just shy of 4 days when it had been verified that she arrived at the airport, surprisingly, her body had already started decomposing. I would assume it being in an airtight car as well as the middle of the summer in New Mexico were the main factors for that. Her car was found with the doors locked and the windows rolled up, which led police to speculate that her killer may have been in the passenger side of the vehicle as they shot her. They did say that her wallet was missing and her purse was on the floorboard, so police think that robbery was the motive. Police, as well as Lola's family, tried to piece together her activities earlier that day on July 31st before she arrived at the airport, hoping for a clue. They were able to verify that she went to the First National Bank on 4th Street between noon and 3 p.m. on that day. As far as her flight plans, she did arrive at the airport, but of course never boarded the flight. She had made some business trips alone for her husband's company in the past, but did not do it often. It was chilling and also disturbing that Lola's body could be visible sitting behind the wheel at a busy airport parking lot for days, and not even be discovered until her sons went there and specifically looked for her. It doesn't appear that Robert Marvin was ever a serious suspect in his wife's murder, according to newspaper accounts around that time anyway. It was stated that he was on business in Canada the day of the crime, and it isn't specified whether they were able to verify that. He seemed to be genuinely distraught at her death, according to his family. The next public mention of Lola's murder was 3 weeks later when Crime Stoppers would offer a $1,000 reward for information in the case. Her family would soon add $5,000 to that, and her friends would add another $5,000, bringing the total reward to $11,000. 2 years later, Robert Marvin would increase the amount to $25,000, but no one would ever be able to claim the reward. Sadly, it seemed that Lola Marvin's murder investigation would grow cold almost immediately. Then this murder would get some publicity 5 years later, but probably not for the reason that you think. On Labor Day, September 3rd, 1984, 55-year-old Robert Marvin would leave an apartment in Moab, Utah at 9:30 a.m. in his 1974 orange and white VW convertible, possibly headed to Telluride or Durango in Colorado to look at condos. Marvin had been in Moab visiting his fiancée and business partner, Betty Farrow. According to Farrow, the couple had been engaged for 3 years, and he would go visit her one weekend a month. His fiancée also said that he had recently cashed in more than $20,000 in Kerr-McGee stock just a week before his disappearance. In Farrow's opinion, her fiancé was dissatisfied with his life and told her that he used dance lessons, business trips, and any other opportunity to get out of the house. On September 6th, Robert's employer, Santa Fe Mining, would phone Robert's house looking for him as he hadn't showed up for work. In the 3 days since he had left Moab, Robert Marvin had apparently disappeared. Police would soon start an investigation into Robert Marvin's disappearance. They would have airplane search for several days, the rugged southern Utah area where he was last known to be, as well as the highway between Albuquerque and Utah. During their interviews, they heard many positive things about him. His sons, now both in their 20s, described their father as a hard worker, honest person, and a good father. His coworker called him a capable geologist, a quiet and decent guy, and said that the people who worked under his supervision seemed to like him. Police would say there had been no monetary transactions in Marvin's account since his disappearance and no confirmable sightings of him or his distinctive-looking car. There was one thing that the geologist's disappearance would once again bring to the forefront, however, and that was his wife's murder from 5 years earlier. Then not long after this disappearance, something would happen that would only add to the already unanswered questions in this mystery. Approximately 1 month after Robert Marvin's disappearance, his orange VW convertible with the white soft top would be located. There are contradictory reports as to where it was found. One newspaper account said it was located in a parking lot at 5th Street and Lead Avenue Southwest in downtown Albuquerque. However, a few other places online would say it was actually found at the Albuquerque airport. I'm unsure if that was just misreported as that was where his wife's car was found, but if true, it would certainly be interesting that both of the couple's cars would end up there. There was apparently a bloody fingerprint found inside Marvin's car when it was searched. Moab police, who were still investigating Marvin's disappearance, said that they didn't even know about the bloody fingerprint until months later because Albuquerque PD didn't advise them. It is uncertain if it was ever tested. Moab PD also said that they'd only been given about 1/10 of the police file, and they also said that they requested to search Marvin's car, but they turned it over to his sons instead. Albuquerque PD said that there was no sense in giving the car to Moab since they had destroyed all the evidence during the process of searching it. Yes, you heard that right. That is a direct quote from the Albuquerque PD representative mentioned in the July 17, 1985 edition of the Albuquerque Tribune. Then one of the couple's sons would come across something in the spring of 1985, 6 years after his mother's death, in her belongings that would only add to the mounting question surrounding this tragedy. What was Lola Marvin really doing the day she was murdered? When going through some of his mother's things, Robert Marvin Jr. found his mother's calendar packed away in a wicker basket in her bedroom. On the date that she was murdered, she had listed the flight number and time of departure of her flight to Oklahoma City, but it also listed something else. Apparently, Lola Marvin also had an appointment with some unknown person at an Albuquerque hotel on the day she was murdered. Her sons were shocked, but also disappointed that police never even bothered to search the couple's home after their mother was murdered. If they had, they could have found this clue 6 years earlier. Police claim that they didn't have enough probable cause for a search warrant, and although they did investigate her husband initially to see if he played a role in her death, they didn't ask permission from the family to search. The family says if asked permission back then, they would have certainly given it. Of course, now it was much too late to find out who their mother might have met at a hotel 6 years prior, which may have led to a significant clue. Something surprising also came out when the sons were interviewed that hadn't been released earlier, and it added yet another layer of mystery to this already bizarre crime. Apparently, after the autopsy of Lola Marvin was complete, it was discovered that her blood alcohol content was at a shocking 0.27, which was almost 3 times the legal limit for driving. But her family was adamant that she did not drink at all. So now their mother has met with some unknown person just hours before she was murdered and was apparently heavily intoxicated, which is something she never did. There were also fingerprints found in her car. However, the police didn't type Lola's fingerprints to rule them out, so it appears that potential lead would also go nowhere due to poor police work. But we have another possible lead in this case that would come in 3 years after the crime. This would open up the investigation more and perhaps finally give the police something to work with. In 1982, an unknown woman from California would phone the police and name Lola Marvin's killer. She was quite specific, even talking about the route taken to and from the scene of the crime. The caller described an out-of-town motel, and police were able to get the registration records from there. However, the suspect she named wasn't listed on them. But Robert Marvin Jr. would reveal something else he found in his parents' belongings that would throw a new twist in this already convoluted death and disappearance. He said that when he was cleaning out his mother's room, he came across an airline ticket stub. It appears that, just a few days after his mother's murder, his father flew to the same small town the tipster listed as where the killer had signed the motel register. At first, when Robert Marvin Jr. was shown the motel register, none of the names looked familiar. But the more he thought about it, one signature was familiar. The couple's son apparently had access to a check that was signed by the person named as the killer by the tipster. Well, the first name on the check was the same name the tipster gave. The son said the signature on the check was a perfect match for the similar name on the registry. Albuquerque PD said that 2 similar signatures with only the first names being the same are not enough to say the handwriting is a match. Police did track down the person the anonymous caller named, but they refused to give any handwriting samples or fingerprints. Unfortunately, law enforcement did not have enough evidence to get a warrant to force them to comply. Police would first need to investigate whether Robert Marvin wanted to disappear, met with foul play, or had some sort of an accident. If leaving willingly or murder was the reason, they would then need to see if that could be a clue concerning his wife's murder. Or if we are to believe what his fiancée said at the time of his disappearance about him being depressed, was suicide a possibility? First off, we need to talk about whether Lola's murder and Robert's disappearance are related. The simple answer is, I don't know. The reasons you could have against them being related are that the police think her murder scene looked like a robbery. Also, when Robert did go missing, it was 5 years later. If it was a murder and directly related to his wife's murder, wouldn't it have happened sooner? I think a clue to Lola's death and Robert's disappearance is definitely with the unknown person that Lola met on the day she was murdered. Was it a clandestine meeting, perhaps an extramarital affair, or did her husband know about the meeting? Since Lola was said to be traveling for Robert's business, was the mystery meeting with someone in regards to that? Could Robert Marvin have been involved in something that was not above board? I say that because this activity seems to be hidden. Perhaps Lola had knowledge of it, and that was why she met with the unknown person before her flight. I am curious as to the statements of Betty Farrow and if they were looked into. One source said that she and Robert Marvin had been dating for 5 years and engaged for 2 years. That caught my attention since Lola's murder was 5 years prior, but there was at least one mention online that claimed that they started dating after Lola's murder. Also, the comment about him being depressed and also cashing $20,000 worth of stock outright before his disappearance. I'm curious if the latter part was verified, as I think that would be easy to do. Well, I thought I had the research pretty well wrapped up for this case when I decided to do another quick search before I finished it. I came across a write-up where apparently someone had done some digging into this case, and I must say what I read shocked me. Now for yet another twist in this case, and it's probably one that you didn't see coming. I didn't anyway. This post was on a Facebook page dedicated to cold cases. I inquired as to their source, but never received a reply. This information is definitely worthy of being mentioned, but realize that I don't know how much is fact and how much is the writer's opinion. The write-up said that Robert Marvin was having an affair with Betty Farrow of Moab, Utah in 1979. They claim that police believed Betty was the one who killed Lola Marvin, so that was why they didn't investigate more fully. It even said that after her murder, Betty ended up with Lola's car. The following year, someone broke into Betty's home and stole property, including a Charter Arms .38. The gun was never recovered, so it wasn't able to be tested to see if it was the same gun which killed Lola Marvin, which was also said to be a .38. Then in 1984, Robert Marvin traveled to Moab to visit Betty Farrow. According to Betty, the two had a business-related argument, which was not uncommon, and Robert left and drove to a nearby gas station. After that, he was never seen again. On October 3, 1984, Robert's car was found. It had been parked in Albuquerque since shortly after his disappearance, it appears. A small amount of blood was found, but they were unable to tell if it belonged to Robert Marvin. Police received a tip that Betty had inquired about flights out of Albuquerque. If this is true, it would be consistent with her driving his car from Moab to Albuquerque, where it was found, and then trying to arrange a way back home. By the way, it is approximately a 6-hour drive between Moab and Albuquerque. There are also unconfirmed reports that Betty had Robert's suitcase after his disappearance. So if this information is true, it certainly puts a different spin on things, and in my opinion would answer more questions. But more questions still remain. Granted, these are just possible scenarios and not necessarily fact-based, but let's talk about if Betty Farrow were responsible for Lola Marvin's murder. That might better explain the mystery person she met up with that day that she was shot and killed. If there was an ongoing affair, did Lola know about it, or was that what the meetup was for, so Betty could tell Lola? Perhaps upon hearing about it, Lola was upset and did start drinking, which she wasn't in the habit of doing. Could they have traveled to the airport together, or perhaps were sitting in the car together at the airport talking when Betty fired the gun 3 times, then locked the door and fled? Or did Lola have suspicions and actually arrange for the meeting? Perhaps Lola had known about the alleged affair, and like so many other women tended to do around that time, chose to look the other way. Was the possible motivation that Betty Farrow was pressuring Robert Marvin to leave his wife and he refused to, so she wanted her out of the picture? As you can see, the possibilities and theories are endless. I am curious how much Robert Marvin knew about the day in 1979. Did he know about the person Lola had arranged to meet up with? And did he know if it was actually Betty Farrow? If he had any suspicions that his alleged mistress had killed his wife, why did he stay with her and even went on to eventually get engaged, if Betty Farrow's account of the relationship is accurate? Or perhaps he confronted her about it initially and she denied it and he accepted her denial. It is possible that he may have continued with her so it wouldn't be revealed publicly the fact that they were having a relationship while he was married, if the accusations are true. Or perhaps there were other clandestine dealings he didn't want revealed, and if he ended their relationship, there was a chance that Betty would reveal them. Let's discuss who could have made the anonymous phone call naming the killer. It seemed from what little has been published, they seem to have at least some credible information. But we can't know if anything or everything they said was accurate until we get more answers about the Marvins. Could Betty Farrow have made the call? If she is responsible for a murder and a disappearance, I don't see why she would make the call, unless she named someone who wasn't responsible to throw police off the trail. Or is it someone who knew credible information about the crime, whether Betty was involved in it or not, and wanted to let people know without revealing their identity? But the bigger question is, who was the person named in the anonymous call? Was it Betty? Or was it someone else? Whoever this person was that was named, could they have had some interaction with the Marvins, as their first name was found on a check in the Marvins' belongings, and if you recall, their son said the signature matched the one on the motel receipt. And now about the signature on the motel receipt. Remember that whatever small town that was in matched the town that Robert Marvin flew to just a few days after his wife's murder. Now, if Betty Farrow and Robert Marvin were having an affair, that would make sense. A secret meeting for the clandestine pair. Or if it wasn't Betty he flew to see, who was it? Someone he was doing business with? It appears that he wanted to keep this trip on the down low, or you would think he would have met up with them in Albuquerque. Now let's talk about the case for Betty Farrow killing Robert Marvin. The first two things that stood out to me about Betty's statement when Robert went missing, which the details are mentioned in newspaper articles, was that Robert was depressed and that he had just sold stock and had gotten $20,000 for it. Those both sound like someone possibly making a case to justify someone going missing. If he was depressed, is she inferring that a suicide is possible? Her claim about the large sum of money would infer that perhaps he left to start a new life. However, it can't be both. Was it suicide or to start a new life? Obviously, the depressed part can't be discounted or verified, as only Robert Marvin knew what was in his mind at the time he disappeared. But you would think that a recent stock sale for a substantial amount of money, by the way, $20,000 back in 1984, is roughly the equivalent of $60,000 today, could definitely be verified, even if the actual money was not located. So I am curious if police were able to substantiate Farrow's claim. Also, if Robert Marvin had just received a large sum of money and was considering suicide, one would think he would want his two sons to share in at least part of it. I'm also unsure what Betty Farrow meant in saying that she was Robert Marvin's business partner. What business? Robert Marvin was still working as a geologist at the same company we know, as they were apparently the first ones to notice he was missing. Was it some other business that Farrow was talking about? Since they were partners in business, did she gain access to the $20,000 if Robert Marvin did indeed cash out his stock? So now we have Robert's wife Lola doing some business for him, as well as his girlfriend, but it isn't clear what actual business they were helping with, which I find at the very least odd. I will say that I really don't think Robert Marvin wanted to disappear. He seemed to have moved on with his life after his wife's murder, and now had a fiancée, a good job, and 2 sons that he had a good relationship with. His disappearance just seems so abrupt, and if he did go missing, who drove his car to the parking lot or airport, depending on which place it was actually found? Or did he drive back to Albuquerque himself and then leave? Factor in that in the now 40 plus years since he disappeared, there have been no sightings of him anywhere. It just seems more likely it was foul play. It's really hard to have a definite theory on what happened in Lola Marvin's murder and her husband Robert Marvin's disappearance. Knowing everything that we've talked about and the information that is out there, it is hard to think there wasn't at least some kind of connection. Of course, if Betty Farrow played a prominent role in both of these events, then there is more clarity in what transpired, in my opinion. It seems, as is the fact in many cases, the answers to these questions are elusive. It doesn't appear that we will ever definitively know who killed Lola Marvin and who was responsible for Robert Marvin's disappearance, if anyone else is. But that's why it is important to keep talking about these old, lesser talked about cases. All it would take is for someone who heard or knows something to come forward to give the Marvins' 2 sons the answers they deserve. Or let them know where their father's remains are so he can be laid next to his wife. Only then will we perhaps learn more about these mysteries concerning being absent and anonymous. That concludes my podcast on Paul Hibbard and the Marvins. If you enjoyed it, please feel free to share it with others and leave me a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find my podcast on Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts under one word, Lost and Found Podcast. You can read all of my original articles as well as links to my most recent podcasts on my website at Lost and Found Blogs. I have social media pages on Facebook, X, and Instagram under Lost and Found Blogs. I also have a Patreon channel with podcasts and articles on lesser-known missing persons cases that you should check out. It is listed under Lost and Found Podcast. You can reach me via email at lostandfoundpodcast@yahoo. And remember that cold cases stay cold because their story stops getting told.